All right, Jordan, diving into this breakdown, we've talked about the injuries over the offseason. We talked about all of the storylines leading up to this game, who's the real Death Valley, who's the real Tigers, so on and so forth. Fan base is going back and forth. Brian Kelly's comments here and there, but it is game week, and it's time to talk about football, the actual game that will be played on the field. And we're going to start off with LSU's offense versus this Clemson defense. And man, oh man, is this going to be a matchup?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, I think, from the perspective of Clemson, this is the matchup. I mean, I think you are going to want to watch most closely. I think this is the side of the ball that I feel like Clemson has the most to prove. With everything we've talked about over the offseason, the supposed culture shift on defense with the addition of Tom Allen and other support staffers, and kind of the overhaul of the overall of kind of how they did everything in terms of preparation, practice, strength and conditioning, everything they redid and retooled. And so, this is going to be the proof of concept, and it's coming really early. That's the thing that makes you nervous, because you're like, okay, man, we don't really have a whole lot of time to ease into this. No, we're playing an LSU offense that is extremely loaded, and they have the opportunity and the chance to really expose some weaknesses if you do have a lot of them. I think when you look at this matchup, and when you look at LSU's offense specifically, one thing that they specifically are going to want to do that they didn't do well last year. I'm interested to see, like, what is the plan as far as running the football.
Yeah.
I think any LSU fan would have a question about that too, because quite frankly, last year they weren't able to, and they didn't really try because of it. Garrett Nussmeier was fourth in the country in dropbacks last season. Now, keep in mind, LSU only played 13 games. They didn't, get that. They didn't play in a conference championship game. They didn't play in a playoff game. Yet Garrett Nussmeier was still fourth nationally in dropbacks. That's not great. They were in the 80s nationally in rushing attempts total. Just an offense that was a lot of passing. And I think one of the things that they didn't do well, despite passing a lot, was hit explosive plays. I think, some of that was, I think LSU's offensive line underperformed in some respects, especially obviously running the football. And then, receivers, they didn't have guys step up. I mean, I think one thing that they did this year in this offseason was they certainly infused this room with a lot of talent. They've had some guys that have already been in the program, Chris Hilton, Xavion Thomas, Aaron Anderson, but you bring in a guy like Nick Anderson from Oklahoma, you bring in Barry and Brown from Kentucky. They have kind of changed the outlook of this wide receiver room to where you have a lot of guys that can make explosive plays. They're not the most physically imposing group of receivers that you'll ever see. Not many of them are over 200 pounds. And not many of them are over like 6'1", but they can run. This is the fastest group of receivers in the country, I would say. One thing that I want to see, I'm interested to see from this LSU offense is how do they go about, getting those guys the ball, but also how do they emphasize running the football? I think really the answer is going to come with their tight ends. I think that's probably the biggest thing that I think kind of went underrated about LSU and LSU in general in the recent years is they've had some really good tight ends. Obviously Mason Taylor goes off to the NFL, but they feel really good about the two that they have. And Trey'Dez Green, who is a basketball player who is a really freakish athlete, and Bauer Sharp, who they brought in from Oklahoma. I think you're going to see a lot of them in this game. I think you could see a lot of heavy sets in order to run the football, but also, they can take shot plays out of that because, Trey'Dez Green is a guy that is, he runs faster than most tight ends you'll see. And he is definitely good for they think he'll be good for an explosive play. He didn't get a ton of burn last year, but obviously they had a really good NFL tight end in front of him. So I guess my question is, like, do we think are they're going to try to establish the run, or are they going to be more of an offense that, we've seen Clemson be at times like last year where, when they weren't running the football well, okay, well, we'll substitute that with the screen game. They certainly have a lot of guys that can get a lot of yards after catch, the quick passing game. Are they going to do a lot of those types of things in order to substitute for the run game? Because they have some really talented backs, but the question is, can they block for them?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and I think that'll tell you the answer to that question when we find it out on Saturday. Will definitely tell you what they truly think of this retooled offensive line that they have. They had a good offensive line, a season ago. They weren't great at run blocking. They were much better at pass blocking than they were run blocking. But a lot of those guys got drafted, right? And they bring in basically a whole new offensive line. It's certainly going to be interesting to see if they try to establish the run early in this game. I think they do. I think LSU is going to come into this game and try to establish the running game against Clemson. For one reason, because Clemson, as much as we talk about this defensive line, and as much as we talk about all the talent across Clemson's defense, they were flat out bad against the run last year. They gave up a lot of explosive runs. They gave up a lot of running yards against a lot of teams that they should not have given up a lot of running yards against. And I think LSU is going to test that run defense. They are going to test and see whether Tom Allen has come in and rectified schematically, because it can't be personnel-wise. We didn't really add too many pieces personally. We added a couple pieces through the transfer portal, but relatively, it's the same defense as last year, minus a couple pieces, specifically along the defensive line, minus Will Helt, right? He's the new face along that defensive line, but it's the same defensive line as last year, right? It's the same linebacker core as last year. So I think LSU is going to come in this game and they will try to establish the run. And when you think about the magnitude of this game, and when you really think about, I talked about this on Ryan Cantor's show the other night, and the game within the game, right? I think this game, and this is not breaking news, like I said on his show, it comes down to the trenches. It's going to come down to who is more physical on the offense or on the line of scrimmage, and who is reestablishing the line of scrimmage in whatever direction, right? Does Clemson's defensive line reestablish the line of scrimmage in a negative way against LSU, or are they able to run block and get some room? They don't have to go and run for, 200, 250 yards against Clemson. They just have to have a formidable run game so that Garrett Nussmeier can sit back there, use play action, use these explosive wide receivers on the outside, and then suddenly it becomes a much harder and longer day for Clemson, right? So the game within the game, it really starts in the trenches, man. The biggest matchup for me heading into this game is Clemson's defensive line versus LSU's offensive line for a couple reasons. The run game, as you mentioned, but also the passing game. Clemson cannot sit back and let Garrett Nussmeier just sit back in the pocket and pick them apart with these explosive wide receivers, because if he has time and he's able to just sit back there and survey the defense, they're going to get open. And that's not to say our corners are bad. I feel really good about our corners. We have a question at safety, not because we don't have good guys at safety, but because RJ Mickens walked out the door, right? I don't think people understand how big of a loss that is. And we have a lot of guys that can fill in those spots, and we feel really good about the safety position. But if you put those guys out there on islands and just allow Garrett Nussmeier to survey the field, it's going to turn into a long day for Clemson, right? So it's really the line of scrimmage for me. Clemson has to stop the run, and they have to get after Garrett Nussmeier as a passer and force him to make decisions faster than he wants to. That's the recipe to slow down this LSU offense if you're Clemson.
Absolutely. And I mean, let's talk about LSU's offensive line, because I think ultimately I think on paper, the biggest, on paper mismatch in this game. LSU's offensive, they lost 3 guys to the NFL draft. One of them a first round tackle. The other one went 3rd round. Actually, 4 got drafted. When you consider Miles Frazier and I'm forgetting the other kid's name. So like they lost some guys. This is a new offensive line in a lot of respects. From what we've gathered through fall camp, 3 of those spots have been solidified. Left tackle, center, right guard, but you still have a question at left tackle. I'm sorry, at left guard and right tackle.
Yep.
And so, I don't really know who's going to win those battles.
And if you heard, like, I don't mean to cut you off, but if you heard their press conference this week and Brian Kelly talking about it,
yeah.
One of the media members asked him about the offensive line, and he's like, we're probably going to rotate in and out. And I think they were kind of drawn back from that. They were like, what? We're going to rotate in and out. And he's like, yeah, it's okay to rotate in on the offensive line. So I think they don't really have it nailed down completely, just hearing Brian Kelly talk about the offensive line. I think they got a couple guys, and they're going to rotate them in and out, and they're probably going to see who's playing better and stick with that guy.
Yeah. I'm really, as much as, tackle is big, I think they do, I would guess we see Weston Davis at right tackle.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know that. I mean, but I think the really intriguing battle is between DJ Chester and Paul. I can't pronounce his last name. Paul Mubenga. DJ Chester was a guy that started for them last year at center, and he's since gotten his job taken by the Virginia Tech transfer Braylon Moore, and so they kind of moved him to guard, and he's kind of competing for that spot with Paul Mubenga, who got in a decent bit last year, but really, neither one of them, when we saw them, played particularly great. That's why they brought in Braylon Moore, because they needed help on the interior. So my question is especially when you consider what Clemson has at defensive tackle, can you win those matchups decisive enough to stifle LSU's run game? Because my worry is that, I don't know if LSU is going to just, run all over Clemson.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so, but hey, look, the Citadel ran all over Clemson last year. So this is
ran all over Clemson.
This is me projecting right now. But can you like completely dominate the way that you would expect on paper if you have a a first round pick at defensive tackle and another potential second, third round pick at defensive tackle and Peter Woods and DeMonte Capehart? Are you going to win those battles decisively enough to where okay, LSU is just they flat out give up on running the football? If you can get LSU to give up on running the football, I think that's ideal.
Yes.
If they're getting 3.5, 4 yards a pop, that's not like that's not crazy, but that keeps them on schedule. It forces you to have to respect it. It makes things a lot more difficult as a defensive coordinator than when you feel your guys are going to win their matchups one-on-one up front, and they're not going to have much of a running game to speak of, and they're going to be behind the chains more often than not. You're going to get more second, third, and longs. Like all of those things, kind of, especially over the course of a 60-minute ball game, those things add up in terms of those drive opportunities. So like that is my concern. I think because we have the scars from last year. It's still in our head. We are extremely, high on the talent of this defensive line, but the quality of play last year did not always show it. Yeah. Yes, Peter Woods, he slimmed down. He's back at his original position. DeMonte Capehart is healthy. You got in help on the edge with Will Helt, and you feel like you've developed some of the depth behind him and TJ Parker. But we still got to see it, man. We still got to see it. You got to win. You got to win your one-on-ones.
Yeah.
And you got to dominate them.
And you mentioned that little semblance of a running game for LSU. If they are able to establish that, things get a whole lot easier for Garrett Nussmeier in the LSU offense, right? They're able to hit those play actions. They're able to allow those receivers to run and get open because Clemson can no longer, affect them in that way. So they can't make them one-dimensional, right? And just pin their ears back and come after Garrett Nussmeier because they got to be worried about the run. So it's definitely, in my opinion, the biggest question mark heading into this game is the LSU offensive line versus the Clemson defensive line. I'm really, I'm excited to finally see this defense out on the field under the tutelage of Tom Allen, right? We've heard the mantra all offseason about we want to be the best tackling team in the country. They're making a point that they want to stop the run this year. And, they're saying all the right things, right? But there ain't no ramp-up game in week 1 for Clemson to kind of get the kinks worked out, right? You're rolling into a big top 10 matchup week 1 at home, and you need to win, right? So we're going to find out really early, I think, if Clemson's run defense is any better, because I do think LSU is going to try to challenge them. I do think they're going to try to run the ball and establish it because that is going to make their night significantly easier on offense if they can establish the run. And I think that'll probably be their game plan going in, to try to establish the run early and then use that to make Garrett Nussmeier's night a little bit easier in the Valley. So that's kind of two opposing big-time things going up at once, but it's going to be fun to watch. But there's certainly question marks on both sides of the ball, both on LSU with their offensive line and then Clemson. Have they rectified the defense? Are they better at stopping the run? Because last year that was one of the worst run defenses in a long time that Clemson's put on the field. But with that said, those guys are coming in with a certain chip on their shoulder this year because they know last year wasn't to the standard. They know that they didn't play up to their ability last year, and they fell short of what the standard of defense is at Clemson. So you could always play into that and be like, well, they're going to come out motivated and ready to prove a point, and that very well may be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, like I said, this is the biggest. I mean, this group has the most to prove, I think, in this football game.
Absolutely.
If you don't go out and win the matchups, you should. That's it's not it's not the nail in the coffin for your season or anything like that. But it is something where you're like, okay, we might not be as good as the media thinks we are.
Yeah. And You go out and lose this game, and it will significantly change the atmosphere around this team, at least from a fan media kind of perspective. Internally, whatever. That's them. That's the coaches. They will think what they will internally, and I'm sure they will be just fine. But from a fan standpoint and a media standpoint, the atmosphere will change in a quick way if you let LSU come into Death Valley and beat you. Let's talk a little bit about Clemson's secondary, right? I mentioned that we feel pretty good about the corners. The safeties, we got a lot of guys with a little bit of experience, but I mentioned R.J. Mickens walking out of the door and him kind of being the quarterback of your backfield last year, right? Like he was that player on the field, but he was also a coach on the field because he had been there for so long and just knew so much football and such a high IQ guy. When they're going up against these LSU, wide receivers, these new guys that they brought in, they got some explosive guys. They're looking to be more explosive this season in the passing game. What do you feel like is that sort of matchup, and how do you feel like these LSU wide receivers and these Clemson DBs match up against each other?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, you mentioned the safety room. I mean, I'm keeping my eye on it. I mean, they've gotten really, really strong reviews out of camp. They feel like they have a lot of guys that will play and that can play at a high level. And I do really like the talent in this room, between Ricardo Jones, between Ronan Hannafin. Obviously you still have Kylan Griffin in the room. You have Khalil Barnes. Like they feel good about the pieces they have to work with. It's just we haven't seen a lot of it, with these guys. Limited experience. And that is my thing. You mentioned R.J. Mickens and what he meant to this defense. Obviously, I'm I'm leader of the RJ Mickens fan club. Like I'll tell you, like one of the more underrated players to come through here. And I think the NFL is validating that. It seems very likely he's going to make the 53-man roster for the Chargers. He was a really, really good player in the preseason. Like that's a guy that he was an underrated gem that you were able to have for multiple seasons. That's just gone. He's gone. And so, now you're kind of in a situation where, can you get that level of play last year where I think the secondary largely was pretty good last year. I mean, when you think about it, I saw a stat today in Clemson's 4 losses, they only gave up 3 passing touchdowns last year. 3. And 2 of them were in the first game to Carson Beck. So, I think that kind of puts things into perspective. Like they didn't get beat a ton. Some quarterbacks had better games than others, but they largely held up very well. So, can you keep that level of consistency? When you have, Avion Terrell in his money year and Ashton Hampton as a true sophomore looking to build on his phenomenal freshman season. Can you get that? Those guys get that help on the back end? You have the returning of Jaden Lucas, and of course Shelton Lewis is back from injury. You have guys that you have a lot of pieces that you feel good about. Brandon Strozier and Corian Gibson are going to be guys that are going to be stepping into bigger roles this year. You feel good about the state of the cornerback room. So then now the question is, can you get that same level of play from the safeties? And when it comes to this LSU offense and these LSU skill players. Finishing tackles, first of all. I mean, you've got a lot of big physical DBs. They don't have a lot of big physical receivers. You do the math, it's simple physics. If you're coming down and making a tackle and you with more force than the receiver is coming at you, you should win that battle. But if you're not, that's where we have. I mean, that's where we have issues, and that was one thing that we saw last year from this defense in general was failing to finish tackles, and that's what cost you in multiple games last year. Can you do that with these shifty LSU receivers that have elite speed?
Yeah,
that's I think that's my question, and will the communication, especially on the back end, be to the point where you're not busting coverages? Because if you do, it's 6. It's going to be 6.
And that's kind of the piece I was referring to when I mentioned RJ Mickens. Is he was the guy directing traffic back there last year and making sure that everything was covered in the proper way, right? Rolling in these safeties that do have some experience and that we're really excited to see play. You get your eyes looking in the wrong place, you get your eyes stuck in the backfield, and suddenly a dude's banging his head off the goalpost. Because you weren't paying attention to what you were supposed to pay attention to. And these LSU wide receivers, as you mentioned, with their speed, it wouldn't take very much. They get a step on you and they're gone. So it's going to be an interesting matchup to watch on Saturday. And I definitely think we'll get to score predictions and all that stuff later, and we're not going to give it right now, but LSU is going to get their licks in this game. This offense is I think they're too good not to, right? And we do have some questions on defense. They will get their licks. It will be about how this defense responds. I think there will be explosive plays in this game, and they're going to have to respond.
Absolutely. I mean, you got to be able to kind of get off the mat. That's definitely a good point, because I mean the first big play you can't let it, because it's going to happen at some point. You want to limit them as much as possible, but I don't think LSU is going to dink and dunk you for 14 play drives. Like I don't think that's going to be their MO. They're going to want to hit big plays, especially considering what you have up front, and they are going to respect the talent you have up front. So I think that's ultimately like the biggest question is has the mentality, has the culture really shifted under this new defensive staff? Because if not, then we're going to see a lot of what we saw last year, and that very well might get you beat if the offense can't keep up. That's just the reality.
Absolutely. Yeah. So big matchup between this LSU offense and this Clemson Tiger defense. They're going to be ready. Clemson's going to be ready, and it is going to be, I think, a very close and an epic game in the Valley. I can't wait to watch it.